Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Paleontology Fringe Theories Iceberg. Today we're going to finish up Tier 4. You should all know by now how this goes, but before we get started, I need to give my obligatory apology for the big gaps in between episodes. Sorry about that, but don't worry, I actually had a good excuse this time. I worked on a 1 hour and 38-minute video on a science fiction book called West of Eden. It's set in an alternative timeline where dinosaurs never went extinct and now live alongside humans. However, they're not the only things that have emerged, as the humans are forced to go up against a race of intelligent saurians derived from mosasaurs. It's a pretty good book, and I think I made a pretty good video on it that you should all go check out at some point if you haven't already. Alright, shilling done. Also, one last thing I'd like to mention, I hate being one of those YouTubers, but I do have an important message at the end of the video in regards to this series, so it would be very cool of you if you were to watch all the way through. Again, I hate being the watch till the end kind of YouTuber, but you guys hate it when I do the long intros, and you don't always watch till the very end, so it's like, where am I supposed to put the important messages in my videos? You know? Alright, that's it. Let's get into the depths of Tier 4 to see what other weird shit we have to cover. Fossils are Ludus Naturae. Ludus Naturae, or Naturae, not really sure how you pronounce it, or in other cases that I saw while researching this, Ludus Naturae, can have slightly different translations and variations like whims of nature, games of nature, freaks of nature, but the base meaning is pretty much the same. Basically, Ludus or Ludus Naturae is used when describing bizarre forms found in nature, which can be referring to deformities and mutations. In other cases, things that are Ludus Naturae can also be considered playful and artistically imaginative. A good example of this being stones and minerals, including fossils. It was believed by some that these freaks, whims, or games of nature were examples or proof of nature being able to govern or control itself by creating, sculpting, and essentially painting different forms within itself. And of course, this could also be interpreted as divine and/or spiritual powers at play, and that these quote-unquote games were actually tricks by demons or spirits who would grow these remains into the ground for us humans to fall for. Sterkfontein Cave Psychometry. The Sterkfontein Caves are a limestone cave site located in South Africa and have been held of high interest to both anthropologists and archaeologists alike, due to its preservation of several artifacts and fossilized remains of hominins. One specific event associated with this cave, however, was in 1936, when South African paleontologist Robert Broom would discover the skull of what would later be classified as an Australopithecus. The find itself isn't the only thing that makes this event interesting, but also how Broom claimed to have found it. First off, it should be noted that Broom did not believe in Darwin's idea of evolution driven by natural selection, as he found it hard to believe that the variety of life had one specific designer, and instead had multiple designers by ways he refers to as spiritual agencies. And that's what drove evolution, at least according to him. Along with that, in the case of his find in the Sterkfontein Caves, he claimed that he was being guided by spiritual beings that led him to the discovery of the Australopithecus skull. This wasn't the only example of psychometry being used in these caves, though. Broom had an assistant named John Talbot Robinson, who was also a paleontologist and accepted Broom's ideas when it came to spiritual agencies. Years later, well after Broom's death, Robinson would go back to these caves with a psychic by the name of Geoffrey Hodgson. Hodgson wasn't told where he was going or what he would be doing when he got there, but according to the Theosophy World Research Center site, this was what he said about the experience. Dr. Robinson, being a scientist, tried to see how much I was reading his thoughts, because one of the doubts rightly held concerning clairvoyant research is that it is really telepathy and the investigator is picking it out of the directive mind. So this is what he did on several occasions. He gave me an object, my eyes were closed so I could not see what it was, but it felt like a stone. And he said this is so, and so, which was an ape man. He also projected the strongest thought form of an ape man he could into my brain and held it there. Now I was obviously trying to psychometrize. Finally, I said, I am very sorry, I can see no ape man at all, I am stuck with an ape. And I asked him, shall I throw it away out of my consciousness and do what you want, or what would you like? No, he said, go on with your study. Afterwards he told me it was an ape. Now, several times he did that, and if you do any research, I recommend it, even though it is a trick and laying a trap for the poor investigator. According to Robinson, he said, "I was able to work very closely with Geoffrey Hodgson for some months during the late 50s, testing his clairvoyant powers on pieces of fossils of early man about 2 million years of age. Each session, carried out in the field site from which the specimens came, was recorded on a tape recorder. No indication was given him of what I thought of his information until after the series of tests were completed and analyzed." With this, Robinson also said that he believed Hodgson was telling the full truth. He said, "He never misidentified a specimen or gave conflicting statements about a specimen that had been presented more than once. As far as I could determine, his information was always accurate, and he gave me a strong impression of complete reliability." Vascular plants are inside-out lichens. Apparently, it's commonly accepted that modern land plants descended from streptophyte algae, which is a group of green algae, but not everyone had the same idea. In this specific case, Peter R. Stat, associated with the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology of the University of California, Irvine, thought that these land plants were too complex and diverse to come from something as simple as green algae. So he wrote a paper where he suggested a hypothetical ancestor for these land plants, where he states, "The essence of this important proposal is that land plants are reverse phase lichens in which the alga evolved into the dominant component and the fungus became a mineral scavenging endophyte." In other words, this hypothetical land plant ancestor was a lichen with opposite features from that of modern lichens. While the fungi in modern lichens is the dominant component over the alga, the ancestor was a lichen in which the alga was the dominant component over the fungi, hence why the title refers to it as inside-out lichens. Longisquama feathers are actually leaves. The Longisquama is one of the strangest animals in the fossil records because it was a Triassic reptile of some kind that possessed long appendages extending from its back that looked something like that of wings. But it's also just the many mysteries and questions and theories this feature has produced over the years that also make this animal very interesting. The overall purpose of the appendages has been the main topic of discussion and debate for many paleontologists over the years, as it's not entirely known what it's used for. Some described these wings as non-avian feathers, and others believed it has some association with avian evolution. And then there are some that don't think these appendages are actually wings or feathers or anything of the like that belong to the Longisquama, but were instead just leaves that were preserved right next to it, accidentally placed in a position that made it look like it had wings. Those that believe this to be the case have also pointed out that only a single Longisquama specimen has been found where both the body and the quote-unquote feathers are together. The other remains of feathers or the appendages are all without a body, leading some to come to the idea that maybe they aren't feathers at all and are just leaves. Subterranean erosion theory. In 1744, a French surgeon named Claude Nicolas Lecat gave a presentation on an essay he wrote titled Essay on the History of Earth. Very original, I know. Also, I have no idea if that's actually how you pronounce Lecat. I seriously doubt it, but I think it's kind of funny to say the name like that, so I'm just gonna keep calling it that, because, again, it's funny. If I'm wrong, you can make fun of me in the comments if you want, I guess. I don't really care. Anyways, in this essay, Lecat introduced his theory on subterranean erosion, where he states the continuing action of erosion within our planet will eventually hollow it out to the point where it will end up being what he described as a hollowed out orange filled with water, to which it would soon collapse in on itself, taking most if not all living organisms with it in the process. But this wouldn't be the end of Earth. Lecat continues his theory by saying that a new world resulting from this catastrophic disaster was not impossible, and should that happen, most of life would probably return with new inhabitants. However, he was doubtful that humans would be among the things that would return in this new world. Dinosaurs were extinct before the meteor. In 2021, a paper by research scientist Fabien L. Condamine posited a new theory that dinosaurs may have been on the decline well before the asteroid hit the Earth. leading to the idea that even if the meteor had not hit, dinosaurs probably would have gone extinct anyways, or they were already extinct before the meteor even struck Earth. The reason why they thought this was because they noticed the rate of dinosaurs were becoming less diverse, with some species possibly being on the brink of extinction. The way they found this out was by examining over 1,600 dinosaur fossils, representing about 247 species of the 6 most abundant dinosaur families from the entirety of the Cretaceous period, taking place from between 150 to 66 million years ago. For the most part, it seems that everything was alright, but around the 76 million years mark, they started to notice a sudden downturn and gradual decline of diversity and the incline of extinction rates. For example, according to the paper itself, the Ceratopsian family experienced the worst of the diversity decline, reaching a peak of 15 species at one point during the Cretaceous, but by the end of it, there would only be 2 left. Of course, this is referring to non-avian dinosaurs, as the more bird-like dinosaurs would survive and lead to the modern dinosaurs we see today. But now the question is, why was there this sudden decline of non-avian dinosaurs? Of course, there could have been multiple factors, but it was suggested there were 2 main reasons. One was the lack of herbivores. So of the 6 dinosaur families that were examined for this paper, 3 of them were Ceratopsidae, Ankylosauridae, and Hadrosauridae, with the hadrosaurs facing the least worst statistics. But that just says they managed to outcompete other herbivorous dinosaurs, and there were still a decline of them that completely unbalanced the ecosystem. And for the second reason, it came down to global environmental issues like climate change that made the temperatures cooler for the dinosaurs, which relied on warm temperatures to survive. Of course, not everyone agrees with this paper, with some apparently saying there was too much emphasis on the global cooling temperatures, and others arguing that the lack of diversity could be the result of a lack of discovered fossil specimens rather than dinosaur species going extinct before the meteor. Regardless, it's an interesting thought. Preformationism. Preformationism is a late 17th century idea that all organisms were preformed prior to their existence or creation on Earth. In other descriptions, this was the theory that all living organisms originated from many versions of themselves that were already pre-developed, which also suggested that life was created simultaneously. This was a commonly accepted idea for the time, as it was one of, if not the first theory that really delved into the developmental stages of all living organisms from the plant and animal kingdom. There were 2 different versions of this idea, one of which was the ovism model and the other was the spermism model. Some believed these preformed individuals of said organisms were located in the maternal egg, while others were convinced they originated in the head of each sperm. It's obviously now an outdated idea, as after the 1820s the field of embryology would start to advance and offer better ways to view embryo development, leading many to ditch the idea entirely. Pterosaurs could not fly. In 2008, behavioral ecology researcher Katsufumi Sato wrote an article discussing experiments that he conducted on modern birds to prove that it was unlikely large pterosaurs were able to fly. These experiments were pretty minor. He put AA battery-sized accelerometers on the wings of several large seabirds, more specifically the wandering albatross, which was chosen because it's actually the world's largest seabird. The accelerometers were used to measure the wing speed and flapping force that were then compared to that of large pterosaurs. The way albatrosses seem to fly is relying on air currents to glide from and flapping their wings when there aren't air currents. Based on his calculations, Sato concluded that birds, including pterosaurs over 90 pounds, wouldn't be able to fly without the need of air currents due to their large size, and not being fast enough to flap their wings to keep themselves up in the air. He based this off what he observed from the albatrosses. Firstly, he noticed that albatrosses have 2 different flapping frequencies, one during takeoff where it's much faster and one while soaring through the air. Secondly, he noticed the relationship between flapping frequencies and body mass, in that the larger the bird is, the lower its flapping frequency is. Of course, not everyone agreed with this conclusion, with some arguing the lack of consideration for the fact that during the time period, denser air would have made oxygen concentration higher and therefore make it possible for larger pterosaurs, like Quetzalcoatlus, and other Asdarchids to be able to fly. And others just thought the 90-pound limit for flight was ridiculous, as it was such a low limit. Suffice to say, this paper definitely sparked some debates and ruffled some feathers. Dinosaurs killed by rotational deceleration. I can't really find much on this one, but the concept is pretty simple. For this possible theory, it suggested that maybe it was Earth's decreased rotational speed that contributed to the dinosaurs' extinction. This idea came from the fact that days back then, during the time of the dinosaurs, were known to be about 30 minutes to an hour shorter than today's 24-hour cycle. In one example of figuring this out, scientists actually used a well-preserved mollusk shell, which dated back around 70 million years ago, that actually grew a ring for every day that passed. They were able to gauge proper sea temperatures and living conditions for the mollusk, which was called, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to butcher this, but I'm going to attempt it anyways, Torides sanchezi. Again, I could be wrong about that, whatever. Anyways, they were even able to identify a sort of time estimate as well. They were able to identify the days, seasons, years, eventually coming to the conclusion that days were about a half an hour shorter back then than it is now, resulting in more days taking up a year, 372 to be more specific. However, it's also known that the speed at which Earth rotates affects certain parts of the environment. So with that in mind, it's suggested that the slow speed back then during the Jurassic to Cretaceous period may have led to some environmental change that could have negatively affected the dinosaurs and thus possibly led to their extinction. At least that's how I saw it as based on my research. In truth, there's not too much on this one that I can find around the internet at least, but I think that's the gist of it. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comments down below. Breeding stones. This one is exactly what it sounds like. It's literally the idea that stones are able to reproduce by themselves. The Google document that this iceberg is attached to references one example of when this idea was relevant, but I'll admit I couldn't really find any references of this on the internet. However, I'll fill you in on what's said on the document, and if you guys know what it's talking about and or where I can find more information on it, you can let me know in the comments down below. I kind of want to know a little bit more about this one because the idea of breeding stones sounds just batshit insane to me. Apparently, the idea was taken more seriously back in the 18th century, with one of its advocates being German professor of medicine Michael Valentini, who wrote that stones bred deep in the earth. Huh, so that's where earthquakes come from. Breeding stones are also present in folklore, which I was able to find some brief information on via a blog on old European culture. In the Balkans, they have bedrock that are literally referred to as living rocks or living stones. But it seems to be more of a spiritual thing in that they are still a part of the living body of Mother Nature. Sometimes the stones are referred to as Baba stones, which means grandmother stones that were well respected at one point, with shepherds bringing food offerings to put on the stones themselves. In southeast England, legend has it that pudding stones, which are rocky conglomerates of smaller pebbles held together by cement-like rock material, are able to reproduce themselves within the ground. This would start a rumor amongst the community of farmers that moving any kind of stone from their fields or properties to avoid running it over with their farming equipment was pointless, as more would just grow in its place anyways. Another example of this was the Blackshall Stone, a popular site at the Stone Farm in Blackshall, a village in England. According to locals, and this sign in front of the site, in the 19th century the stone was about 1 pound. Today it weighs something around 5 tons, leaving people to suspect that this is some kind of living stone or something. The idea is super weird to me, but I weirdly love it. It brings a whole new meaning to the pet rocks we used to have when we were kids. And when I mean I love the idea, I'm specifically referring to the Blackshall Stone, not breeding stones in general. Harley Garbani ESP. Considered to be one of the greatest fossil collectors by some, Harley Garbani was an amateur paleonthusiast who had what some would call a sixth sense when it came to discovering dinosaur fossils. All his life, Garbani had an interest in dinosaurs and fossils, but never really went to school for it, and thus he was considered an amateur paleontologist by his peers and colleagues. However, that didn't stop him from fossil hunting, which he ended up being really good at. Even at an early age, he found remains of arrowheads on his family's property in an area called Diamond Valley Lake in California. His interest would follow him to adulthood, where he would manage to make several significant finds, even finding fossils of hadrosaurs, woolly mammoths, triceratops, and even one of the most complete Tyrannosaurus rex skeletons ever discovered. Not to mention all of the other smaller scaled finds he'd make of dinosaur teeth and bone fragments and artifacts from primitive indigenous tribes and so on. And in a lot of these cases, he would make some of these discoveries without even really trying. To put it simply, he had a talent for finding fossils that most paleontologists could only dream of. It got to the point where some people jokingly thought he had some kind of clairvoyance or extrasensory perception, ESP for short, towards the fossils he ends up finding. Whatever it was that he had, he would take it with him when he passed away of natural causes in 2011. A few years later, a permanent exhibit under his name would be opened to the public by the Western Science Center, with casts of some of his discoveries being displayed for all to see. Lindsayachida. First reported around 2008, the skull discovery of the Lindsayachida, or Acinonyx curteni, was very significant to the world of paleontology as it was dated to have existed around 2.2 to 2.5 million years ago, making it one of the oldest cheetah specimens ever discovered. Too bad it ended up being another fossil forgery. In 2009, scientists Per Christensen of the Zoological Museum in Copenhagen and G.H. Mazak of the Shanghai Science and Technology Museum would study and write a paper for PNAS based on this primitive cheetah skull, which would get its nickname from the Pliocene deposits of the Lindsay Basin in Gansu Province, China. Well, actually, in regards to the paper, Christensen would be more of a co-author to the study and later revealed that he didn't actually have access to the skull as it was in China. He was given data from the find to help write the paper though. Their paper would catch the attention of Dr. Deng Tao, a Chinese paleontologist of the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology, who would be the one to notice and point out the possibility that this fossil was probably a composite, as there were certain parts of its shape and structure that made no sense for a cheetah skull even if it was a new type. When Tao found out this pair of scientists studied a possible forgery and wrote a paper on it, he attempted to write to PNAS to strongly recommend they retract it, but they responded telling him they couldn't do that. The problem here was Tao was basing his observations only from viewing images of the skull remains and not the skull itself. So to confirm once and for all whether this was a composite or not, he attempted to get access to the materials, but was denied by Mazak himself. So since he couldn't view the remains himself in 2010, he instead decided to address this in a query he presented towards the paper. And in 2011, Christensen and Mazak would say this in a letter from Science. The occipital area and zygomatic arches have been heavily restored in plaster, probably to make it appear more complete, thus enhancing its commercial value, a common malpractice amongst Chinese fossil dealers. After admitting this, the controversy of the skull, which was already somewhat present even before the letters for Science, were even worse for these two scientists. I particularly feel bad for Christensen, to an extent of course, because in the entire time this was going on, he claims he was completely out of the loop. He received no messages from Mazak even after apparently trying to get him to do some x-rays and get more information for them, but this never happened. Now, given all of this happened exactly as it's been explained, Mazak's approach to all of this was definitely sloppy, and his work on the overall study has been criticized heavily by other scientists. However, at least he did admit to his mistake, and finally in 2012 reported this. After further examination, it was determined that the fossil used in the study was a composite specimen from the late Miocene Laterite and not from the early Pleistocene Loess. The article is hereby retracted. Universal Ocean. Also known as Neptunism, this was a very old theory that the Earth was once covered entirely in oceans before the waters would eventually deplete over the span of several billions of years. It was founded by geologist Abraham G. Werner, who suggested there was material in the water that would settle over uneven sea floors, which would form crystalline rocks like granite. Hey, so just a quick correction. Neptunism is actually just the name for this process of material buildup forming crystalline rocks, and not necessarily another name for the old universal ocean theory. However, Neptunism is still heavily associated with it, as you can probably already tell. Over the vast span of time, the suspended sediments would also form the large landmasses and continents that we know today in layers, whose age can be determined based on the materials found within it. According to Werner, lands that contained granite were the oldest and ones that contained fossils were younger. Not all people agreed with this at the time though. James Hutton was a scientist that supported Plutonism, which was the idea that rocks like granite were actually a product of heat and not from sedimentary buildup at sea. This would spark a massive debate and controversy that would last years within the geology community before fizzling out around the early to mid 1800s, as more and more ideas in regards to Earth's geological origins were introduced. Fossils are organic seeds fertilizing inanimate rocks. As if fossil origin theories couldn't get any weirder, there was a pre-modern theory that Earth was able to support life through means of essentially birth-giving. On rare occasions, should animal sperm drip into one of its open pores, what would result is an inanimate rock/animal hybrid, also known as a fossil. Ideas like this were common for the time because they were developed to partly support the idea of an amniotic or birth-giving Earth. And obviously the idea would be defunct as the years went by, and it was eventually found out that these fossil remains were actually animals that existed in the past. Chimp-pig hybrid. Okay, so there's a bit to this one, so bear with me. So basically, there's this doctor named Eugene McCarthy, who works in the Department of Genetics at the University of Georgia. He has a master's and PhD in genetics, and he considers himself to be an expert in the field. Along with that, he's focused a lot of his studies on the concept of man-made and natural hybridizations amongst animals, primarily birds and mammals. Do what you will with this information, but long story short, based on the anatomical evidence and data that McCarthy had studied heavily, he believes there's merit to the idea that humans originated from a chimp-pig hybrid. Again, there's quite a bit of information to this, all provided on his website, macroevolution.net, so if you want to read the full thing, be my guest, but I'll try to summarize it for you as best as I can. So he splits his article on the matter into two parts. In the first part, one of the things he does is attempt to eliminate certain common misconceptions with hybridizations. I said he attempted to eliminate these conceptions. Whether he was successful in these attempts or not isn't up to me because I don't know, I'm not an expert. Some of these ideas he considers to be misconceptions are that animal hybrids are sterile and that they don't occur naturally, and that it only happens to plants and not actual animals. For these arguments, he cites his own book, Handbook of Avian Hybrids of the World, which contains reports and information relating to the matter and basically says that when it comes to hybrid animals being sterile, more times than not, it's mainly just reduced fertility, which doesn't mean they're completely sterile. He says there are a wide variety of especially avian hybrids that occur naturally, also proving that it can happen amongst animals and not just plant life. He also introduces the idea of backcrossing, and in his words, backcross hybrids are produced when hybrids from a first cross mate with either of their two types of parents that produced them. When the resulting progeny mate again with the same parental type, the result is the second backcross generation, and so forth. He also mentions that human origins does have a connection with this idea and starts this segment out by pointing out that humans have abnormal sperm, both in appearance and a high percentage of them being dysfunctional, making their fertility rate lower than other animals. Both of these characteristics are apparently common in hybrid animals as well, leading to the idea that humans could be a hybrid product of two parent animals. The question was, what were these two parents? McCarthy continues this by saying one plausible parent would be a primate of some kind, a chimp to be more specific, as they are the closest to humans genetically speaking. So what was this other parent? I don't even know why I'm asking to build suspense at this point, because you've seen the title of the entry and I literally told you in the beginning what it was. He spends the second part of this hypothesis providing us how he figured out what the potential second parent could be by providing a list of attributes this said parent would have to fit as a compatible parent to humans and a compatible partner for chimps. Based on what's said in his article, this hypothetical second partner would be an intelligent animal with a protrusive cartilaginous nose, a thick layer of subcutaneous fat, short digits, and a naked skin. It would be terrestrial, not arboreal, and adaptable to a wide range of foods and environments. And one of the few possible animals that fits this description was the pig. More specifically, the sus scrofa. Sounds crazy? Yeah, sure, I'd say so. Do you have a different take on this idea with absolute certainty? Well, too bad. You're not allowed to do that because according to McCarthy, anyone who speaks with certainty on this point speaks from prejudice, not knowledge. Alright, I may be exaggerating that a little bit. He does explain that the world of genetics is still a work in progress, so not everybody can have a certain answer, so I suppose this statement makes a bit of sense. Anyways, I think you guys get the gist of this. There's a lot more to it, so if you want to read more about it, check out his article. It's definitely weird, and no, I'm not saying that with certainty. Don't worry, McCarthy, your chimpanzee pig fucking theory is still safe. Pithecanthropus tulpa. In the early 1900s, there would be a man by this name, to which I'm not going to pronounce out of fear of being severely bullied in the comments section. Actually, I'm just a lazy asshole and I don't really want to look it up. But this man had very interesting psychic abilities of supposedly being able to summon spirits. But this isn't like most cases with psychometry that we've covered on this series, because with this one, this man didn't want to create a spectacle out of it, and kept the performance of his abilities to a minimum. It got to the point where he would even go by a different name, Frennik Kluski, specifically for times he would perform seances to maintain respect in his more personal and professional life. That didn't seem to work out very well, seeing that we know him today, but I digress. In a lot of these seances, Kluski would have a bowl of wax sitting out, so when the spirits were summoned, they would dip their body parts like their hands or feet into the wax to leave imprints, to which molds would be later created to show what was left behind. And while spirits were mainly in human form, like this figure in a military outfit standing behind them in one of their seances, sometimes they came in the form of animals as well, like the appearance of this bird. However, one apparition that would make reoccurring appearances during these seances was the Pithecanthropus. Pithecanthropus is a former genus of hominid discovered in the late 1800s and was given to two specific specimens that are now classified as Homo erectus. But according to a few accounts, the Pithecanthropus would actually appear during some of these seances and was described as a large and very strong ape-like man with long tangled hair and who was not very bright. It had a habit of smacking its lips, it was a bit mischievous, but overall good-natured, and would even sometimes lick the participants on certain occasions. Of course, like most, if not all mediums, there was some skepticism towards Kluski's abilities. But there wasn't really any kind of monetary gain for Kluski when it came to his seances, as he would never try to profit from it. And again, this was something that he didn't want to make a huge deal over. He didn't do public seances, he did them occasionally, and it's been reported that after performing the seances, it would result in him being sick for the few days that followed. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean this is 100% legit. One of the more common things that popped up during my research was an incident in which one participant asked Kluski if the apparition could make a face impression in the wax. When the participants opened their eyes, they would see not a face, but an ass print on the wax. In the days after the seance, it was apparently reported that Kluski was recovering from burns on his ass, leading many to just put two and two together and think it was him behind the imprint during the seance, making him a fraud. Along with this, it's also claimed that he confessed to faking his abilities, but from what I can see, there doesn't seem to be any official record of it, and it's only coming through word of mouth, but definitely not something to completely ignore. Regardless, the whole story is just a crazy one to follow. N-rays caused dinosaur extinction. N-rays were a newer form of radiation discovered in the early 1900s by physicist Prosper René Blondlot, who had been experimenting with X-ray polarizations before making the discovery. He would write a paper on the new radiation and gave it the name N-rays, the N standing for the town that he lived in, which was called Nancy. The rays would be viewed by other scientists, and soon hundreds of papers would be written about it only months after Blondlot's initial paper. Properties for this ray would be found through wood and metal, and some even said it was emitted by the sun. And other theories and ideas would be made on the N-rays as well, like the brief idea that the rays could have been responsible for the mass extinction of the dinosaurs, where its effects were probably much more powerful and deadly. However, in 1904, another physicist by the name of Robert Wood would get involved and had Blondlot set up several demonstrations in which they would be able to view the rays themselves, as he was a bit skeptical about it and wanted to settle whether or not this phenomenon was actually occurring. Based on one source, it says, in the most well-known demonstration, Blondlot showed how N-rays could be spread out into a spectrum by an aluminum prism. Blondlot claimed to detect this spectrum by noting a slight increase in brightness at some point along the phosphorescent strip. Wood would see no evidence of the N-ray spectrum. In a golden opportunity to really prove whether or not this was true, Broom would take away the prism when nobody was looking, which is described as a crucial component to the demonstration, and asked Blondlot to perform it again. Not knowing about the absence of the prism, the demonstration was done again with the exact same results that appeared when the prism was there. This was done several more times without the prism, with the same exact results every time, leading Wood to be fully convinced Blondlot and his associates were just imagining the rays, rendering them non-existent. Precambrian nuclear reactor. In 1972, uranium deposits, or nuclear fission reactors, were discovered in the mines of Okla Gabon around the area of Central Africa, and it's estimated that they were active around 2 billion years ago. While it's considered to be one of, if not the only example in the world of a naturally developed nuclear reactor, others can't help but speculate that this could be evidence of a previous, possibly Precambrian civilization. And honestly, these pre-existing civilizations sound like they could be science fiction stories. Someone should get on that. Agassiz dreamfish. Louis Agassiz is a name that I've mentioned here on the Iceberg before from the Gressalosaurus Madness entry. In that entry, he was the boss of Amon's Gressley and stole some of his fossil collection and skipped town. When Agassiz wasn't stealing fossils from people, he was working on his various other projects and passions, some of which involved prehistoric fish. In truth, he's had several contributions to the world of science, but for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to focus on his fish obsession. During the years between 1833 and 1844, Agassiz was working on a massive research project, attempting to list and catalog all known fossil fish at the time. And if you remember from the Gressalosaurus Madness entry, I mentioned that this would actually be the project that would send him into debt, and is the reason he would skip town. Anyways, there was one incident during his research for this project where he came across a fish fossil, most of which was buried within the stone it was trapped in, making it hard to tell what the specimen looked like. He didn't want to extract it and risk damaging the fossil, so he resorted to just examining what he could of it before eventually setting it aside to go to sleep. That night, he'd dream of that very fish with all of its hidden features completely exposed and restored. But when he awoke from that dream, the image disappeared. The following night, the same image reappeared, and when he was awake, it would once again fizzle out of his memory. So on the third night, he kept a pencil and paper to the side of his bed before going to sleep. And again, the fish appeared in his dream as distinct as ever, causing him to awaken in the middle of the night to sketch what he had dreamt of in a half-awakened state. The following morning, he looked at his sketch and didn't really think much of it at first, as the overall shape of the fish's head seemed outlandish and impossible, but he would use his drawing as a guide anyways to eventually excavate the fish from the stone, and when he did, he was surprised to see that it matched up perfectly to what he dreamt and sketched of. So was this a coincidence, or an actual example of some kind of vision that Agassiz had? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Dark vitalism. Dark vitalism is the more modern and darker side to the theory of vitalism, something I covered much earlier in the Iceberg, which was the theory or idea that living organisms differed from non-living organisms in the sense that we have a vital spark or life force that goes beyond any kind of science, and is what keeps us alive. Dark vitalism is, I think, the idea that the biological existence of life is not without the darker and disgusting parts as well. It's a pretty vague definition, I know, but I can't really find any kind of specifics when it comes to this. I can only assume that one of the meanings or mentalities behind this is something along the lines of you can't have life without death. But again, there might be more to it that I just don't understand or don't know. Maybe there's someone out there that has a better gauge with the idea of dark vitalism than I do, and they can maybe explain it to me better in the comments down below. Nessie is Tully monstrum. Hey, here's another throwback. The Tully monster is one of the strangest and mysterious finds in the fossil records. It's a bizarre looking animal with a fish-like body, eyes that stick out like antennas, and a long appendage with a mouth at the end of it. Truly an alien-looking creature, so much so that to this day scientists don't fully know what it's supposed to be or what family it belongs in. I won't go through everything about it since it's had its time here in another entry, but I do want to just take this moment to correct myself. Before I said it belonged in the Cambrian period. I don't know where I got that from. It actually belongs in the Carboniferous period. Anyways, within the context of this entry, there's a book called The Great Orm of Loch Ness, in which the author, a journalist named F.W. Ted Holliday, suggested the Loch Ness monster was really just a very large Tully monstrum. I mean, I surely hope that's not the case, because look at this thing. It's this big, and it looks terrifying. Now imagine this creature several million times larger. Honestly, that kind of makes for a great monster movie though. Somebody should get on that. Anyways, his book covers some of the sightings that have been made on Nessie and how it may relate to his Tully monstrum hypothesis, how the elongated appendage with its mouth at the end could be mistaken for a neck and head. Over time, his ideas on the Loch Ness monster would start to bleed over his ideas of the paranormal, and soon he came to the conclusion that animals like the Loch Ness monster, along with mermaids, Bigfoot, and so on, existed, but most likely not in the same way that we do. Instead, he believes them to be semi-physical entities of some kind that were actually placed here on Earth by some kind of greater being whose intelligence far exceeds our own. Very weird stuff, but I kinda like it from a sci-fi horror standpoint. Supernova killed the dinosaurs. In the early 80s, it was discovered that there were high global iridium levels in the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary strata where the KT extinction occurred. This actually somewhat supports the hypothesis that predates the discovery by 10 years. In 1971, two scientists suggested the possibility of a supernova, and the resulting radiation would wipe out the dinosaurs, explaining the high levels of iridium on the strata boundary. These two scientists were physicist Wallace Tucker and paleontologist Dale Russell, who we've seen from earlier on in the Iceberg, as he was the one behind the dinosauroid thought experiment that would lead to this now very well-known humanoid dinosaur. For those of you that don't know what a supernova is, it's the explosion of a star that has essentially reached the end of its life, in the sense that it's expanded to its maximum size before succumbing to the heat-generated pressure of nuclear energy, and causing the biggest explosion to take place in the universe, which can apparently radiate more energy than the sun in its entire lifetime. This seems like it was building up to be a plausible idea, but there was a problem with it. While the boundary strata contained high levels of iridium, it should also contain high levels of plutonium. But when tests were ran, there was no plutonium, meaning this most likely wasn't the case. Human brain fossil from Carboniferous coal. This one took a lot of digging, most of which led to nowhere because I couldn't really find any online footprint of this entry. Of course, we always have the Google document, which describes an event that took place in 1925 in which a scientist by the name of Dr. N. Grigorovich discovered what he thought to be fossilized human brains in a coal quarry. With how weird this topic is, I needed to know more, but I was having a very hard time finding anything on this topic. So I messaged Sustained Disgust himself, who actually revealed it was from an excerpt from a book that I briefly mentioned here on the Iceberg already, which is titled Did Spaceman Colonize the Earth by Robin Collins. After doing some more digging, I was able to find a digital copy of the book and finally found the page he was referring to. In Odintsovo, Moscow, there was a discovery of a yellow-brown fossil that appeared to be a brain, but not just any brain, a human brain. Brain discoveries aren't impossible, they're just very rare. What's even more peculiar about this find, however, was that it was found in limestone sediments that dated back to the Carboniferous period. Surely, this wasn't possible, right? Maybe it wasn't even a brain at all and was mistaken for a Carboniferous animal of some kind. Well, according to the text, no matter what kind of logical reasoning geologists came to, this was undoubtedly a human brain, as it held several characteristics that confirmed this. According to the text, it says, "Even after all these years, the stone brain still remains an insoluble enigma. For this amazing fossil has, in its remarkably striking resemblance to a human brain, a longitudinal dividing fissure between the two hemispheres, more than 15 convolutions, plus the cerebellum and vermis cerebelli." So this begged the question, who did this brain belong to? Could it possibly support the idea that a spaceman from a distant past visited Earth and died here? If this fossilized brain belonged to a spaceman and looked almost identical to that of modern humans, then that could mean there's a relation there, which could also prove our possible extraterrestrial origins. Yes, this section of the book actually considered this hypothetical and continues it by even positing the question of, could humans' diverse system of language be an indication that several Earth people came from different planets with their own single language? And if this was the case, it's guessed that maybe they started out advanced, but when they arrived on Earth, this language became more and more simplified, resulting in what we see and hear today. Now you may be wondering, well, what about all of the previous finds that have filled in the gap of our evolutionary history that we have here on Earth? The book argues that these links of mankind's evolutionary history should be of great abundance, but they're not. Minimal evidence may be the very proof that our evolutionary history was not a gradual rise from primitive animals, but rather a gradual simplification of a previous advanced ancestor from outer space. There's a lot that branches out from this one find, and it's definitely a lot of weird and crazy ideas, but fun to read about nonetheless. However, the fossil brains were apparently placed to belong in the Middle Pleistocene, in which early humans existed in, which would make more sense than the stone brains being placed in an age before the dinosaurs existed. Chien Gu. Chien Gu is a Malaysian chemist who founded a new field of science that I don't really think has been officially accepted. This field is called petrified embryology, which was founded around late 2019 according to Chien Gu. And he's written several books about his studies behind it. In one of the volumes he's written, he defines the field as one of the methodologies developed by me that used to explore prehistory life in searching and study of the formation of paleontological mummies, especially their appearance. Compared to paleontologists who are passionate about digging up dinosaur bone fossils, petrified embryology is looking for the mummified specimen of baby dinosaurs called silicified embryo, petrified embryo. Yeah, if the sentences sound a bit wonky, it's because English isn't his first language, and there's probably some issues with the translations and whatnot. Anyways, the concept sounds interesting, right? Well, to put it simply, the problem with this study is that he's just interpreting these mummified baby dinosaurs from rocks that are very loosely dinosaur-shaped. Apparently, he uses a 3-combination visualization test to determine what baby dinosaur is within the rock, and what the position of it looks like. And these 3 tests are the Modern Animal Embryo Reference Test, the Superimposed Test, and the Alignment Test. And the results are these apparent shapes and figures of what are apparently mummified baby dinosaurs. There's more to this that you can dissect yourself if you want. He has a website and all of his books are free, but be careful. This is is another field you're not allowed to criticize, especially since this dude literally compares his studies of the new field that he apparently discovered to that of Charles Darwin on his actual websites. It's kind of funny. Pangenesis. Pangenesis was an early and now outdated theory of hereditary to explain the passing of traits from parents to offspring. Since genes were relatively unknown at the time, originally brought up by Charles Darwin in 1868, he suggested the cells within living organisms were able to shed particles that he would call gemmules. The gemmules are what holds the traits of the parents that will eventually be passed down to the offspring. But before that happens, the particles would course throughout the body before finally meeting in the testicular regions. And he explains that this ties into his theory of evolution as well, because should the parents of the given species go through some sort of environmental change, that will affect the cells as well, which will result in the release of modified gemmules that will be passed down to the offspring. However, when tests were ran to verify whether this was the case or not, it was concluded that there wasn't any solid evidence of Darwin's pangenesis theory and was ditched altogether. And that was the final part of Tier 4 and another tier of the iceberg completed. That actually kind of brings me to my important message. The 5th tier of this iceberg is the final tier. And initially I was just going to split it into 2 videos, pretty much the same thing I've been doing for most of this series, but then I realized this is the final tier. And this is a series that has greatly helped the channel out in the past a little over a year that it's been around. I've had a lot of ups and downs with it, but overall, it's a series that I hold near and dear to my heart, and I want to end it right. So instead of just making a split video, I'm just going to do the entire tier all in one go. It's going to be a lot of work because there's almost 40 entries on this tier alone. To give you some reference, this episode had 25 entries in it, and I don't even know how long it's going to end up being. But I can guess it's going to be long. So yeah, if the next episode is taking even longer than usual to get done, it's because there's more that's being covered, and no doubt it's going to be the longest episode yet. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you are too. Thank you all so much for watching, and please have a nice day.